Bismarck C. March 3, 1943, 0800 hours, and Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura stood on the bridge of destroyer Shirayuki, commanding 8 of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most battle-hardened destroyers, escorting 8 transports loaded with 6,900 troops desperately needed at La, watching the morning sky over the Solomon Sea with growing unease as his radar operators had no equipment capable of detecting what was coming. Completely unaware that American B-25 Mitchell bombers approaching at wave top height had been transformed into something his naval training had never prepared him to face, Strafer gunships carrying more forward-firing machine guns than a squadron of fighters, about to demonstrate in the next 15 minutes why every assumption the Imperial Navy held about bomber attacks was catastrophically wrong. The convoy had departed Rabaul on February 28, 1943, with Kimura flying his admiral's flag from Shirayuki, leading destroyers Shikinami, Uranami, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Asashio, Arashio, and Asagumo, everyone a Guadalcanal veteran that had survived the savage night battles of Iron Bottom Sound, escorting 8 transports carrying the 51st Infantry Division under Lieutenant General Nakano Hidemitsu, troops that could tip the balance in New Guinea if they reached La, and Kimura knew the risks, had studied the war games at Rabaul that predicted 40 to 50% losses from Allied air attack, but Imperial General Headquarters had deemed those losses acceptable if half the convoy got through, because the alternative was watching the Allies systematically destroy Japanese positions along the New Guinea coast without reinforcement. What Admiral Kimura couldn't know from his position on Shirayuki's bridge that morning, was that 500 miles south at Port Moresby, General George Kenney of the 5th Air Force had spent the last 3 months transforming his B-25 Mitchell bombers with a former Navy Chief Petty Officer named Paul Irvin Gunn, known to everyone as Pappy, who had taken standard medium bombers and turned them into flying battleships, installing 4 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns in the nose where the bombardier position used to be, adding 4 more in blister packages on the fuselage sides below the cockpit, creating a concentrated wall of firepower that could clear a destroyer's deck in seconds, while perfecting a technique called skip bombing where the aircraft would come in at mast height, 200 feet or less, and bounce their bombs across the water like stones into the sides of ships. The modifications had begun after Kenney arrived in Australia in summer 1942 and discovered his bomber force was achieving a pathetic 3% accuracy rate against Japanese shipping, watching helplessly as convoy after convoy delivered troops and supplies to sustain Japanese operations, until Pappy Gunn, a 52-year-old former enlisted naval aviator who'd been flying in the Philippines when war broke out, convinced him that the problem wasn't the bombing but the approach, that trying to hit moving ships from 5,000 feet was futile, that they needed to get down on the deck and deliver their ordnance at point-blank range, which meant suppressing the anti-aircraft fire that would tear apart any bomber making a low-level run, which meant guns, lots of guns, more guns than any bomber had ever carried before. Gunn had started with the A-20 Havocs of the 3rd Attack Group, installing 4 50-caliber machine guns in the nose, scavenging weapons from wrecked fighters because official channels couldn't provide them fast enough, test-firing the installations until he discovered that the muzzle blast from guns mounted behind the propeller arc would peel the skin off the fuselage, forcing him to extend the barrels with blast tubes that reached past the props, solving one problem only to discover that the concentrated firepower of 4 nose guns would crack the aircraft's structure, requiring reinforcement plates and shock-absorbing mounts, each solution creating new challenges that Gunn attacked with the determination of a man who'd lost his family to Japanese imprisonment in the Philippines. By December 1942, Gunn had moved on to the B-25 Mitchells, a bigger aircraft that could carry more guns and more ammunition, working at the Townsville Modification Depot with mechanics from the 38th Bomb Group, cutting away the greenhouse nose designed for a bombardier and installing a shortened solid nose packed with 4 50-caliber machine guns, then adding the blister packages on the fuselage sides that would give the design its distinctive appearance, each package containing 2 more 50 calibers with 400 rounds per gun, the ammunition boxes mounted inside the fuselage with blast shields to protect them from the muzzle flash, while test pilots reported that firing all 8 forward guns simultaneously felt like hitting a brick wall in midair, the recoil actually slowing the aircraft's forward speed. The first combat test had come in January 1943 when modified B-25s attacked a Japanese convoy attempting to reinforce La, achieving hits but not the decisive results Kenney wanted, leading to further refinements in tactics, with pilots practicing skip bombing runs against the wreck of SS Pruth, a freighter that had run aground on a reef near Port Moresby in 1924, learning through trial and error that the ideal approach was to come in at 200 feet altitude and 300 miles per hour, dropping to mast height at 600 yards from the target, releasing a stick of 4 500-pound bombs with 5-second delay fuses at 300 yards, the bombs skipping across the water to strike at or below the waterline while the pilot pulled up and over the target, clearing the ship's superstructure by mere feet. The practice runs weren't without casualties, as one B-25 collided with the Prutha's mast during a training run. Another was damaged by fragments from its own bombs detonating too close, and several aircraft returned with pieces of the target vessel's structure embedded in their wings and fuselages. But by late February 1943, the 5th Air Force had dozens of modified B-25 strafers with crews trained in skip bombing, coordinating with Australian Beaufighters that would suppress anti-aircraft fire with their 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, creating a deadly combination that was about to be unleashed on Admiral Kimura's convoy. Meanwhile, across the globe in the Atlantic, German U-boat commander Captain Lieutenant Werner Henke, commanding U-515, had just received reports from Naval High Command about increasing Allied air patrols that were making their traditional surface operations increasingly dangerous, forcing submarines to remain submerged for longer periods, reducing their speed and effectiveness, with new long-range aircraft like the B-24 Liberator closing what had been the mid-Atlantic gap where U-boats could operate. Beyond the reach of land-based aircraft, while Admiral Karl Donitz at U-boat headquarters in France studied the loss reports showing that Allied aircraft were becoming devastatingly effective at catching U-boats on the surface, particularly the modified bombers equipped with powerful searchlights and depth charges. The German submarine force had entered 1943 with confidence, having sunk over 6 million tons of Allied shipping in 1942, their wolf pack tactics coordinating multiple submarines to overwhelm convoy escorts, but the introduction of escort carriers, long-range aircraft, and improved radar was beginning to shift the balance, with U-boat losses climbing from 27 in 1940 to 87 in 1942, and the trend accelerating in early 1943 as Allied aircraft equipped with new centimetric radar that German detection equipment couldn't sense caught surfaced U-boats by surprise, while experiments with flak U-boats, submarines equipped with heavy anti-aircraft armament designed to fight it out on the surface with attacking aircraft, were proving that staying surfaced against determined air attack was suicide. In the Mediterranean, Italian naval commanders at La Spezia and Taranto were still recovering from the psychological shock of watching their battle fleet decimated by British carrier aircraft at Taranto in November 1940, when swordfish biplanes, obsolete-looking fabric-covered relics from an earlier era, had delivered torpedo attacks that sank or crippled 3 battleships in harbor, demonstrating that the age of the battleship was ending, that air power could reach anywhere, strike anything, and that the Regia Marina's lack of aircraft carriers and effective radar would prove fatal in a war increasingly dominated by aircraft, a lesson reinforced every time Allied bombers appeared over Italian naval bases, forcing ships to scatter to avoid the fate of sitting ducks at anchor. Admiral Angelo Iacchino, commander of the Italian battle fleet, had written in his war diary about the frustration of trying to operate in the Mediterranean without air cover, describing how Allied aircraft would shadow Italian task forces for hours, radioing their position to submarines and surface units, making surprise impossible, turning every sortie into a potential ambush, while the few Italian aircraft available for naval cooperation lacked the range and equipment for effective reconnaissance, leaving Italian commanders blind while their enemies saw everything. A disparity that had resulted in disasters like Cape Matapan, where British carrier aircraft had crippled the battleship Vittorio Veneto and enabled the destruction of 3 heavy cruisers in a night action. Back in the Bismarck Sea, as the morning of March 3, 1943 progressed, Admiral Kimura received reports from his escorting Zero fighters that American B-17 flying fortresses were approaching at high altitude, the type of attack the Japanese had prepared for, with his destroyers taking evasive action while anti-aircraft guns elevated to maximum range, the convoy turning to present the smallest possible target as bombs began falling from 20,000 feet, most splashing harmlessly into the sea. As expected, though one transport took a direct hit that started fires below deck, manageable damage that the ship's crew could control, nothing that would stop the convoy from reaching La the next morning. But at 1,000 hours, Kimura's lookouts reported something different, aircraft approaching from the south at extreme low altitude. So low they were difficult to spot against the ocean surface, their engine noise masked by the convoy's own machinery until they were almost upon them, and as the first wave of B-25 strafers and Australian Beaufighters swept in, Kimura experienced a moment of incomprehension, These weren't behaving like any bombers in Japanese naval doctrine. They were coming straight at his ships at masthead height, and suddenly the air was filled with streams of 50 caliber tracers as 8 forward-firing guns on each B-25 opened up simultaneously, the concentrated firepower sweeping across Shirayuki's deck like a scythe. The Japanese had never encountered anything like this concentrated strafing attack, as each B-25 strafer unleashed over 3,000 rounds per minute from its 8 forward guns, the armor-piercing and incendiary rounds punching through the destroyer's light anti-aircraft shields, through the deck plating, through anything in their path, while gun crews who moments before had been tracking high-altitude bombers were literally blown apart by the concentrated fire, their 25mm anti-aircraft guns designed to engage aircraft at altitude, unable to depress low enough to target aircraft skimming the wavetops, leaving only small-caliber machine guns to respond, their fire ineffective against the B-25's armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks. Lieutenant Commander John Hennebrey, leading the first wave of B-25s from the 90th Bombardment Squadron, later described the attack run. "We went in so low that the prop wash was throwing up spray behind us, 8 ships ahead spread across the sea, and as we opened up with all guns, you could see our tracers walking across the water and up the side of the transport, across the deck where men were running for cover that didn't exist, the incendiary rounds flashing as they hit, and at 300 yards we pickled our bombs, pulled up hard to clear the masts, and looking back saw the bombs skip once, twice, then slam into the hull right at the waterline. The skip bombing technique that Pappy Gunn and the 5th Air Force had perfected turned every B-25 into a precision weapon. As pilots who had trained against the Pruthwreck put their bombs exactly where they wanted them, the 500-pounders with their 5-second delay fuses punching through the thin hull plating of transports before detonating inside, the explosion contained by the ship's structure magnifying the destructive effect, while near misses that detonated alongside created massive water hammers that crushed hull plates and sprung seams, flooding compartments faster than damage control could respond. Within the first 3 minutes of the attack, transport Kyakusei Maru took 4 direct hits from skip bombs and began listing heavily to port, her captain ordering abandoned ship as ammunition in her forward holds began exploding, sending debris hundreds of feet into the air, while Tio Maru, struck by incendiary rounds from strafing bowfighters that ignited fuel barrels lashed to her deck, became an inferno that spread faster than her crew could fight it, men jumping overboard to escape the flames only to be machine-gunned in the water by following aircraft, a tactic the Allies had adopted after Japanese fighters had strafed American aircrew in parachutes earlier in the war. Admiral Kimura on Shirayuki's bridge watched in horror as his carefully arranged defensive formation disintegrated. Destroyers that should have been providing anti-aircraft coverage were fighting for their own survival as B-25s assigned to each warship made repeated strafing runs, their 8 forward guns turning upper decks into charnel houses, while skip bombs aimed at the destroyer's engine rooms threatened to cripple their ability to maneuver, and through the chaos he could see more waves of aircraft approaching, B-25s at low level, B-17s at medium altitude, Australian bowfighters sweeping in from different angles, a coordinated attack that gave his gunners no single threat to focus on. The destroyer Arashio took 3 direct hits from skip bombs that destroyed her engine room and started uncontrollable flooding, her captain attempting to beach her on a nearby reef before she sank. But another wave of B-25s caught her dead in the water, their strafing runs killing most of the damage control parties trying to save the ship, while destroyer Tokitsukaze, hit by bombs that detonated in her forward magazine, simply disappeared in a massive explosion that threw debris onto ships 500 yards away, taking down the Army Commander General Adachi Hatazo and his entire staff who had been aboard. By 1015 hours, just 15 minutes after the first low-level attack began, 7 of 8 transports were sinking or sunk, the 8th mortally wounded and abandoned, while 4 of Kimura's 8 destroyers were either sunk or sinking, the admiral himself wounded by machine gun fire that had raked Shirayuki's bridge, his flagship stern blown off by a bomb explosion that detonated her depth charges, and as he transferred his flag to destroyer Shikinami, Kimura could see hundreds of men in the water, some clinging to debris, others simply floating face down. The sea around the shattered convoy turning red with blood as sharks, attracted by the carnage, began attacking survivors. The Japanese Navy's after-action report, compiled from survivors' accounts, described the attack as unlike anything they had encountered in the war, the combination of overwhelming firepower from the strafing runs that suppressed all defensive response, followed immediately by precision skip bombing that put bombs exactly where they would do the most damage. The whole attack coordinated so that ships trying to aid stricken vessels became targets themselves. Rescue operations impossible under the continuous air assault that lasted through the morning as Allied aircraft returned to Port Moresby, rearmed, refueled, and came back for additional attacks on any vessel still afloat. Captain Tamichi Hara, commanding destroyer Matsukaze in another convoy, would later write about the reports that reached the Japanese fleet after the Bismarck Sea disaster, describing the shock that ran through the Imperial Navy at the completeness of the destruction, the fact that not a single soldier of the 51st Infantry Division reached La, that the vaunted destroyer escorts that had dominated the Solomon Islands night battles were helpless against this new form of air attack, and most disturbing, that the Americans had developed these tactics specifically to counter Japanese naval operations, turning their bombers into anti-shipping weapons that could strike anywhere within range of their airfields. At Rabaul, the Japanese Southeast Area Fleet Headquarters, Staff Officer Commander Masatake Okumiya recorded the impact of the battle. Our losses for this single battle were fantastic. Not during the entire savage fighting at Guadalcanal did we suffer a single comparable blow. We knew we could no longer run cargo ships or even fast destroyer transports to any front on the north coast of New Guinea, east of Wewak. The Americans had achieved complete air superiority, and their new tactics made surface vessels virtually defenseless. The myth of the destroyer's speed and maneuverability protecting it from air attack died in the Bismarck Sea. The battle's impact rippled far beyond the Southwest Pacific, as Allied air forces in other theaters studied the success of the B-25 Strafer modifications and skip bombing tactics, while General Kenny, promoted and decorated for the victory, pushed for more B-25s to be modified to the Strafer configuration, eventually seeing the factory-produced B-25J model incorporate 8 forward-firing 50-caliber guns as standard equipment, with some variants carrying up to 18 machine guns total, including top turret, waist, and tail positions, creating flying gunships that would devastate Japanese shipping throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. In Germany, Admiral Donitz received intelligence reports about the Bismarck Sea battle through Japanese naval attaches, noting with concern the effectiveness of concentrated aerial strafing against surface vessels, a tactic that could be equally devastating against U-boats caught on the surface, and within weeks of the battle, new orders went out to U-boat commanders emphasizing the need to crash dive at the first sign of aircraft, abandoning any attempt to fight it out on the surface, while resources were poured into developing snorkels that would allow submarines to run on diesel engines while submerged, reducing their vulnerability to air attack. The U-boat force's Black May was only 2 months away, when the combination of long-range aircraft, escort carriers, and improved Allied tactics would result in the loss of 41 U-boats in a single month, forcing Donitz to withdraw his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes, admitting in his war diary that the Battle of the Atlantic was lost, that aircraft equipped with radar and depth charges had made the traditional U-boat warfare of surface attacks and wolf pack tactics obsolete, just as the B-25 Strafers had made traditional surface convoy operations obsolete in the Pacific. Italian naval commanders, studying both the Bismarck Sea battle and the increasing effectiveness of Allied air attacks in the Mediterranean, recognized that without aircraft carriers and modern radar, the Regia Marina was effectively neutralized, confined to port or restricted to operations under the cover of land-based aircraft that were themselves being steadily destroyed by Allied bombing, while convoy operations to North Africa became increasingly costly as modified bombers using similar low-level tactics devastated Italian merchant shipping, forcing the use of submarines and small fast vessels for supply runs, inadequate to sustain the Africa Corps operations. The technological revolution that Pappy Gun had initiated in the modification shops of Townsville, taking a standard medium bomber and transforming it into a Strafer gunship, represented a fundamental shift in naval warfare, demonstrating that aircraft properly equipped and employed could dominate surface vessels regardless of their speed, armor, or defensive armament, a lesson written in blood across the waters of the Bismarck Sea where the oil slicks and debris fields marked the grave of an entire Japanese convoy, destroyed in 15 minutes by modified bombers that had cost a fraction of what a single destroyer represented in resources and manpower. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, called the Battle of the Bismarck Sea the decisive aerial engagement of the war in the Southwest Pacific, noting that it had secured the northeastern coast of New Guinea from Japanese reinforcement, making possible the Allied advance that would eventually lead to the Philippines, while the psychological impact on Japanese forces was even greater than the material losses, knowing that any movement by sea within range of Allied airfields meant almost certain destruction, forcing them to rely on submarines and barges moving at night, insufficient to maintain their scattered garrisons. The B-25 Strafer design continued to evolve through 1943 and 1944, with later models incorporating a 75mm cannon in addition to machine guns, though many pilots preferred the pure gunship configuration, finding that the concentrated firepower of multiple 50 calibers was more effective than a single large-caliber weapon, while tactics refined from the Bismarck Sea experience saw B-25s operating in coordinated strikes with fighters suppressing air opposition, strafers eliminating anti-aircraft defenses, and skip bombers delivering the killing blows, a combined arms approach that would devastate Japanese shipping until the end of the war. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Gunn, promoted and decorated for his innovations, continued developing new modifications and tactics until his death in a plane crash in October 1957, but his legacy lived on in the thousands of Japanese vessels sunk by Strafer gunships, in the doctrine of low-level anti-shipping attacks that became standard in air forces worldwide, and in the fundamental principle he had proven, that with enough forward firepower, a bomber could become a ship killer, overwhelming any defense through sheer weight of fire, a principle demonstrated with devastating clarity in those 15 minutes over the Bismarck Sea. The Japanese Navy's official history, compiled after the war, identified the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as the point where Japan lost effective use of the sea lanes to New Guinea, forcing them onto the strategic defensive for the remainder of the war, while individual ship captains and convoy commanders had nightmares about low-flying B-25s appearing out of nowhere, 8 guns blazing, knowing that their anti-aircraft weapons designed for high-altitude bombers were useless against aircraft attacking at mast height, that their speed and maneuverability meant nothing when the enemy could put a wall of lead across their path. In the broader context of World War II, the success of the B-25 Strafers demonstrated that innovation and adaptation could overcome numerical and material disadvantages, that a 52-year-old former enlisted man working with scavenged parts in a modification depot could develop tactics and technologies that would change the course of the war, that the marriage of skip bombing and concentrated forward firepower could turn a medium bomber designed for level bombing from altitude into one of the most effective anti-shipping weapons of the war, a transformation that caught the Axis powers completely unprepared. The last survivor of Admiral Kimura's staff, who had been rescued by destroyer Shikinami after Shirayuki sank, would later testify at war crimes trials about the attack, describing how the American bombers had seemed to come from nowhere, flying so low that they appeared to rise out of the sea itself, their nose guns lighting up like welding torches as they bore in, the sound of their engines drowned out by the hammering of 50-caliber rounds tearing into steel, and then the bombs skipping across the water with almost playful bounces before slamming into hulls with devastating effect. The entire attack so fast, so coordinated, so overwhelming that defense was impossible. The effectiveness of the B-25 Strafers would be proven again and again throughout 1943 and 1944, at Wewak where they destroyed 60 aircraft on the ground and sank numerous vessels in harbor, in the Philippines where they devastated Japanese attempts to reinforce Leyte, in the Netherlands East Indies where they made Japanese coastal shipping impossible, each success building on the lessons learned at the Bismarck Sea, refining the tactics, improving the modifications until by war's end, the sight of B-25s approaching at low level was enough to make Japanese crews abandon ship rather than face the inevitable destruction. German naval attaches in Tokyo, reporting on the Bismarck Sea battle and its aftermath, warned that similar tactics could be devastating if employed in the Atlantic or Mediterranean, that the concentration of forward firepower demonstrated by the B-25 Strafers exceeded anything mounted on existing naval vessels for anti-aircraft defense, that the combination of strafing to suppress defenses followed by skip bombing to deliver killing blows represented a tactical innovation that made surface vessels obsolete in areas within range of enemy air power, warnings that would prove prophetic as Allied air forces adopted similar tactics worldwide. The Italian Navy's experience in the Mediterranean paralleled that of the Japanese in the Pacific, as Allied aircraft equipped with forward-firing cannon and rockets devastated convoy operations to North Africa, forcing the Italians to attempt supply runs with submarines and small fast craft, inadequate to sustain military operations, while the few remaining major surface units huddled in port under whatever air cover could be provided, knowing that venturing out meant facing the same fate as Kimura's Convoy, destruction from the air against which there was no effective defense. As 1943 progressed and news of the Bismarck Sea filtered through military channels worldwide, naval planners began reassessing fundamental assumptions about surface warfare, recognizing that the era of the battleship and even the destroyer as masters of the sea was ending, that aircraft properly equipped could dominate any surface vessel, that the B-25 Strafers had proven air power could not only sink ships but could do so with an efficiency and economy that made traditional naval operations unsustainable, a lesson that would shape naval development for decades to come. The pilots who flew the B-25 Strafers at the Bismarck Sea would go on to become some of the most decorated aviators of the war, their success spawning an entire generation of low-level attack specialists who would perfect the art of ship killing from the air, while maintenance crews who had worked with Pappy Gun to install the gun packages and reinforcements became experts in field modifications, adapting aircraft to specific mission requirements, a flexibility that gave Allied air forces a decisive advantage over their more rigid opponents. In the final analysis, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented more than just the destruction of a Japanese convoy. It marked a fundamental shift in the balance of power in the Pacific, demonstrating that air power properly applied could control sea lanes more effectively than surface fleets, that innovation and adaptation could overcome traditional military advantages, and that a handful of modified bombers flown by determined crews could achieve what entire naval task forces could not: the complete annihilation of enemy shipping in minutes rather than hours or days. The legacy of the B-25 Strafers extended far beyond World War II, influencing the development of dedicated ground attack aircraft like the A-10 Thunderbolt II with its massive forward-firing cannon, establishing the principle that concentrated forward firepower could overwhelm any point defense, a principle proven in those 15 devastating minutes over the Bismarck Sea when Admiral Kimura watched his entire convoy disappear beneath the waves, victims of an innovation that had transformed medium bombers into the deadliest ship killers of the Pacific War. For the Japanese Navy, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea became a turning point from which there was no recovery, forcing them to abandon any hope of maintaining their New Guinea garrisons by surface convoy, condemning those forces to slow starvation and eventual defeat, while the psychological impact of the complete destruction of an entire convoy protected by 8 destroyers sent shock waves through the Imperial Navy, shattering the confidence that had carried them through the early war victories, replacing it with the knowledge that American innovation and industrial might would inevitably overwhelm them. The Germans learned from the Japanese experience, but too late to prevent their own disasters, as the U-boat forces' attempt to fight it out on the surface with aircraft in 1943 resulted in catastrophic losses that broke the back of the submarine campaign, forcing them underwater where they were slow and increasingly vulnerable to detection, while in the Mediterranean, Italian naval forces could only watch helplessly as Allied aircraft systematically destroyed their ability to operate, reducing the once proud Regia Marina to a coastal defense force unable to project power beyond the range of land-based fighter cover. Admiral Kimura, who survived the battle despite being wounded, would spend the rest of the war in increasingly desperate operations, but never forgot those 15 minutes over the Bismarck Sea when he learned that everything the Imperial Navy had taught about naval warfare was obsolete, that 8 forward-firing machine guns on a modified bomber could do what entire squadrons of torpedo planes might fail to achieve, and that the Americans had found in Paul Pappy Gun and General George Kenny the perfect combination of innovation and determination to revolutionize aerial warfare against shipping. The statistics from the Battle of the Bismarck Sea tell only part of the story. 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers sunk, approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors killed, against Allied losses of 4 aircraft and 13 aircrew, but those numbers don't capture the revolution in military thinking that the battle represented, the proof that air power had superseded sea power, that a bomber modified in a field depot could be more effective than a destroyer built in a major shipyard, that innovation and adaptation could overcome tradition and doctrine. In the broader context of World War II, the B-25 Strafers represented American ingenuity at its finest, taking an existing aircraft and transforming it into something its designers never envisioned, solving each technical challenge through practical experimentation rather than lengthy development programs, getting results in the field that would have taken years to achieve through normal channels, a flexibility and adaptiveness that would prove decisive in winning the war, turning the tide in the Pacific through innovations like skip bombing and concentrated forward firepower. The last Japanese transport to sink in the Bismarck Sea, Oigawa Maru, went down in the evening of March 3, 1943, torpedoed by American PT boats that found her drifting and abandoned, her crew having been taken off by destroyers that themselves were fighting for survival, and as she slipped beneath the waves, she took with her not just supplies and equipment desperately needed at La, but also the Imperial Navy's confidence in their ability to protect convoys, to maintain sea lanes, to fight the kind of war they had trained for, replaced by the terrible knowledge that the Americans had changed the rules. The success of the B-25 Strafers influenced aircraft development worldwide, as air forces recognized the value of concentrated forward firepower for ground attack missions, leading to aircraft like the Soviet Il-2 Sturmovik with its heavy armor and powerful armament, the British Hawker Typhoon with its rockets and cannon, and eventually jets like the American A-4 Skyhawk and A-7 Corsair II that carried on the tradition of low-level attack aircraft capable of delivering devastating firepower against surface targets, all tracing their conceptual ancestry back to those modified B-25s over the Bismarck Sea. For the pilots who flew the mission, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea became the defining moment of their war, the day when everything they had trained for came together in perfect execution, when months of practice against the Pruth wreck paid off in bombs that skipped exactly as intended into Japanese hulls, when the countless hours of gunnery training resulted in streams of 50 caliber rounds that swept enemy decks clear in seconds, when they proved that properly equipped and trained air crews could dominate surface vessels regardless of their defenses. The maintenance crews who had worked around the clock to modify the B-25s, installing gun packages, reinforcing structures, extending blast tubes, solving each problem as it arose, could take pride in knowing that their innovations had worked exactly as intended, that the aircraft they had transformed from standard bombers into Strafer gunships had performed flawlessly under combat conditions, that their field modifications had proven more effective than anything coming from the factory production lines, a validation of American mechanical ingenuity and practical problem-solving. In Japan, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea entered military history as one of the great disasters of the war, studied in staff colleges as an example of how technological surprise could overcome numerical and tactical advantages, how the failure to anticipate enemy innovations could result in complete catastrophe, and how the rigid adherence to traditional doctrine could blind commanders to new threats, lessons that would influence Japanese military thinking for generations, emphasizing the need for flexibility and adaptation in the face of changing technology. The photograph that became iconic from the battle, taken from one of the attacking B-25s, shows a Japanese destroyer turning desperately to avoid incoming bombs while streams of 50 caliber tracers arc across the water toward it. The sea around it pocked with splashes from near misses, smoke pouring from fires started by incendiary rounds, capturing in a single frame the overwhelming nature of the attack, the concentration of firepower that made defense impossible, the revolution in naval warfare that occurred in those 15 minutes over the Bismarck Sea. General Kenny would later write that the Battle of the Bismarck Sea vindicated everything he had believed about air power, that it proved bombers could control sea lanes more effectively than navies, that innovation and adaptation could overcome material disadvantages, and that given the right modifications and tactics, his air crews could accomplish anything, a confidence that would drive continued innovations throughout the war, making the 5th Air Force one of the most effective tactical air forces in history, built on the foundation laid by Pappy Gunn's modified B-25s. The Japanese Navy's response to the Bismarck Sea disaster was to essentially abandon daylight convoy operations within range of Allied airfields, shifting to submarines and fast destroyers running at night, a tacit admission that they had lost control of the sea lanes, that air power had trumped sea power, and that the traditional naval strategies that had served Japan for decades were obsolete in the face of American innovation, a recognition that came too late to change the course of the war, but influenced naval thinking worldwide. As the war progressed and B-25 Strafers continued to devastate Japanese shipping throughout the Pacific, the modifications pioneered by Pappy Gun became standardized, with North American aviation incorporating 8 gun noses into production models, adding more armor protection for low-level operations, improving ammunition feed systems to prevent jams during sustained firing, and strengthening structures to handle the stress of repeated strafing runs. Evolution guided by combat experience. From the Bismarck Sea and subsequent operations. The human cost of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was staggering for Japan, not just in the 3,000 soldiers and sailors lost, but in the irreplaceable experienced crews, the trained infantrymen desperately needed at La, the destroyer captains who had survived Guadalcanal only to die in the Bismarck Sea, losses that Japan with its limited manpower could not afford, while the Americans lost 13 airmen, a ratio that demonstrated the overwhelming advantage of air power properly applied against surface vessels, a lesson that would be repeated throughout the Pacific War. In the aftermath of the battle, Allied intelligence intercepted Japanese communications expressing shock at the completeness of the destruction, the effectiveness of the low-level attacks, and most significantly, the inability of traditional naval defenses to counter the new tactics, with one Japanese admiral reportedly stating that the Bismarck Sea had shown that the age of the surface warship operating independently of air cover is over, a recognition that came too late for the Imperial Navy but would influence naval development worldwide for decades to come. The B-25 Strafers would continue operations until the end of the war, their success at the Bismarck Sea making them one of the most feared weapons in the Pacific, with Japanese sailors reportedly abandoning ship at the first sight of low-flying Mitchells rather than face the devastating firepower they brought. A psychological impact that multiplied their effectiveness, making them weapons of terror as much as destruction, their distinctive silhouette with the solid nose packed with guns, becoming a symbol of American air dominance. The technical innovations that made the B-25 Strafers possible, from the blast tubes that prevented muzzle flash damage to the reinforced mounting points that could handle the recoil of 850 caliber guns firing simultaneously, represented American industrial problem-solving at its best, taking an existing design and adapting it to meet new challenges, solving each problem through practical experimentation rather than lengthy development programs, getting results in the field that would have taken years to achieve through traditional channels. For Admiral Kimura, wounded and watching from Shikinami as his flagship Shirayuki sank stern first into the Bismarck Sea, the 15 minutes of the main attack must have seemed like hours, watching helplessly as transport after transport was torn apart by bombs and gunfire, as destroyers that had survived the hellish night battles of the Solomons were overwhelmed by daylight air attack, as everything he had learned about naval warfare proved useless against an enemy that had changed the rules of engagement, turning bombers into gunships that could destroy a convoy faster than traditional naval forces could react. The influence of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea extended beyond military circles, as news of the complete destruction of a Japanese convoy reached the American public through carefully censored reports that emphasized the innovation and courage of American aircrews while downplaying the slaughter of survivors in the water, building morale on the home front and supporting war bond drives with tangible proof that American forces were winning, that innovation and determination could overcome the enemy, that victory in the Pacific was not just possible but inevitable. In Germany, the Kriegsmarine studied the Bismarck Sea battle with growing alarm, recognizing that if similar tactics were applied in the Atlantic, their U-boats caught on the surface would be just as vulnerable as Japanese destroyers, leading to increased emphasis on snorkel development that would allow submarines to operate submerged for extended periods, and new tactics emphasizing crash dives at the first sign of aircraft, abandoning any attempt to fight it out on the surface. Lessons learned from Japanese experience but applied too late to prevent the U-boat force's catastrophic losses in 1943. The Italian Navy, already reeling from losses to British air power in the Mediterranean, saw in the Bismarck Sea battle confirmation of their worst fears, that without aircraft carriers and modern radar, surface vessels were effectively defenseless against determined air attack, that the era of the battleship and cruiser as arbiters of naval power was ending, replaced by aircraft that could strike from beyond visual range with devastating effectiveness, a recognition that led to increasingly desperate attempts to avoid engagement while preserving what remained of the fleet. The legacy of Pappy Gunn and his modified B-25s lived on long after the war, influencing aircraft design and tactical doctrine worldwide, establishing principles of ground attack that remain valid today. Concentrate maximum firepower forward, suppress defenses through overwhelming volume of fire, and deliver ordnance at minimum range for maximum accuracy. Principles proven in blood over the Bismarck Sea when 8 forward-firing guns changed the course of the Pacific War, when skip bombing proved more effective than torpedo attacks, when innovation triumphed over tradition.